If you were to do a Google search with the words Merida and archaeology, what results do you think would come up? Well, there would be Chichen Itza, Uxmal, probably Balam, maybe even Koba and Tulum. But is that what you asked? No, you asked archaeology Merida, archaeology in Merida. Now, a lot of people think that there is virtually no archaeological evidence of pre-Hispanic times to be found in the contemporary city of Merida, but this is absolutely just not true. The remains of carved stones that have been put into the facades of different structures, like theaters or even churches and things like this. But we don't see any monumental architecture. There have been some really interesting excavations done in the core of Merida, and these have revealed things like burial sites and all sorts of foundations of what would have been larger structures at some point way back in the classic period. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about monumental archaeology found within the city limits of Merida. Now, of course, because Merida is so old, it was, founded hundreds and hundreds of years ago, construction in the main square area has, over time done away with any large constructions. But this wasn't the case until relatively recently. Until the early 20th century, it was still possible to see the foundations and large mounds of pre-Hispanic structures. These, of course, are no longer there as they were slowly eroded away and had their building materials used to construct other structures in and around the area, or simply taken away because they were now blocking roads that were connecting different parts of the city. Here we can see a picture of Merida in the 1930s. Now, as you can see, it basically stretched only as far as what now we call the oldest part of Paseo de Montejo, right? So anything beyond that is absolutely new. And as we can see in this picture, the city sure has grown. Merida is now the largest city of the Yucatán Peninsula, with a population of a little bit over 1 million people. So of course, it has spread out in all directions. But a lot of that growth has been relatively recent, which is good for archaeologists because since the 80s or so, things started to get a little bit more strict when it came to housing development and simply just bulldozing down archaeological sites. Some regulations started to come into place, and not that they're perfect and that bulldozing of ancient sites doesn't happen anymore, but not on the same level. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at archaeological sites that exist within the urban context of Merida and kind of get rid of this myth, dissuade this idea that there is no archaeology to be found in Merida itself. Now, as you probably know, Merida was known as To or Ixcansijo back in ancient times. The city existed in a context with Sibichaltún to the north, other large centers like Sojila, with which we see quite a bit of influence from the Petén, and it's very interesting. It sits within a hacienda, but is unfortunately not open to the public as it's on private land. There's quite a bit of a dispute going on there. And then on the other side, we have Acanque, and between the three of these, you kind of form like a bit of a triangle. And this is the area which we're going to be concentrating on, generally speaking, but more specifically within the boundaries of urban Merida itself. Now, technically speaking, Sibichaltún is part of Merida, and the village Xoclán, which surrounds it, is one of the oldest inhabited communities in all of Yucatan. This is super interesting, and of course Sibichaltún is a fairly considerable archaeological site, quite large, and is believed to actually perhaps been the dominant political entity of the region, which would have meant that Ixcansijo would have possibly been under its domain. But that's a topic for another video, and actually we covered it in a video about Sibichaltún, which you can find information about down in the description. So starting off, we have the archaeological park of Sublanke. Sublanke is quite large and a very nice place to go for a walk in the morning, take your dogs, it has nice paths and everything. But of course, the main attraction here for us are the archaeological remains. We can see several mounds, which were most likely residential, And in this drone footage here, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 pretty clearly discrete mounds. But if we switch to a map, we can see that it is closer to 10. Now these are quite large in size and very considerable. This was obviously the location of elite residences, and its extension, its sheer size makes it quite important and sheds quite a bit of light on what pre-Hispanic Merida, or at least this area out in Kaukil, would have been like during this time period. Now, another of the really interesting places we can check out in Kaukil is Shanila. Shanila is really unique because it has a Mesoamerican ball court, sorry, or pok-tapok. It just so happens that this is one of the most ancient, not just in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, but anywhere, dating to around the 8th century BCE. This is very old for this kind of architecture, especially in the northern Yucatan, so it really merits special attention. It is also, as far as I know, the only ball court within a major urban area in Mexico, or perhaps even Mesoamerica. If I'm wrong about that, please let me know in the comments. Very close to the ball court, we also have another site we usually call Sojila. In this site, we can see, again, fairly large residential complexes, and also several natural formations or caves, which were then covered in stucco and used as chultunes. A chultun being, of course, the way that the Maya used to store water, right? They would find these crevices in the ground or create them, cover them in stucco, and then use them as water reservoirs during times of drought. But of course, there are cenotes also in the area, so this is just kind of a secondary source of water. But when you have a population as large as they did, you need all the water you can get. It's interesting because Sublanke is also located, not Sublanke, sorry, Sonot Shanila, right behind a high school. So you have students walking by all the time. I talk to them a bit about it. They don't really know very much about the site. And this is something which I find very interesting, right? There's all these monuments within Merida, antiquity, and there's not a lot of awareness about it. And that's something which I'm really trying to change through my PhD research, but also through the production of videos like this and other materials. Now, one of the largest archaeological reservoirs in the city is the Parque Arqueológico de Poniente, or also called sometimes Yaxtal. This is, again, an archaeological park run by the municipality. It is one of the better taken care of sites. It features large pyramids atop artificial platforms. It also has Cehpech running across, which are considerable in size and would have connected this part of town with the core of Ixcanxico, right in the middle of the ancient city, or the city-state, right? So that's really interesting and important in and of itself. Here we also find ancient constructions just amongst, homes, right? So it's kind of cool. You have like pharmacy, ancient mine structure, then some houses, another ancient mine structure, then maybe a school. So it's a really great example of urban archaeology and people living, with the remains of this great civilization, sometimes quite literally in their backyards. Another thing that we can see at this site here at Yaxtal, or Parque Arqueológico de Poniente, are constructions in roundabouts. So what has started to happen is that when archaeologists are surveying land for construction and they come across these types of remains, sometimes what they'll do is they'll just build a roundabout around it, right? So that way you don't have to destroy it and you can still allow traffic to go around. And besides, civil engineers in Merida, for some reason, love roundabouts, which I think work really well, but that's beside the point. But it's a rather ingenious way of preserving cultural heritage and also just not making a mess of traffic and city planning at the same time. Speaking of the Cehpech at the site, this one is quite large. As you can see on the photo, it is really several meters wide. There's also what is probably a little a checkpoint station right there to make sure that goods coming in and out are being inspected and taxed adequately. So this also gives us a bit of an idea of the importance of this site within, the metropolitan area back then, and its importance to the greater Mayan world, since of course all these, city-states are connected through Cehpech, which are roughly analogous to Mayan roads. Right within the comisaria or town of Kaukil, we also find a really impressive pyramid. It's quite large, well over 10 meters tall, though it used to be quite a bit bigger. Now we basically just see a bunch of rocks. This is because for a long time people in the community have been using these carved stones for constructions in their own homes, for building walls, and the like, right? We even now have a little niche dedicated to the Virgin of Guadalupe right on the pyramid. This is something which you see fairly common in Mexico and Mesoamerica in general. But it's a really interesting reminder and a really great example of religious syncretism, especially when we consider that the town's main church is just a couple blocks away. Of course, when you see a structure like this, you know that it was not built in isolation, and it would have had, large plazas and a lot of other constructions around it, but those don't survive. The only one that really survives is this pyramidal structure. There are, of course, a lot of other remains in Kaukil, one of them being Alesia, which we can see a photo of right here. Then we also have the Glorieta de Jade, or Jade Roundabout, another example of what we were talking about before. We also have a park called Los Laureles, which has some archaeological remains and also some more wells and choltones, and also the Reserva Archaeologica de Kalash, which, although does not have any reconstruction done at all, is interesting, A, because it's so big, and B, because we really do see the remains of a lot of mounds. These have been very badly pillaged, but we do see evidence of staircases, and if you pay attention, a lot of the times you can see at least the corners of these ancient structures. So that's really interesting and worth checking out as well, especially in the context of everything else that we've talked about. So basically, what we've been talking about in Kaukil here is a bunch of different archaeological remains within a constrained geographical area, as we were talking, dating to roughly as early as the 8th or 9th century, sharing architectural features, residential areas, ceremonial areas, infrastructure like Cehpech. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Nohoch Kaukil is a real thing. But usually when approached in the literature, all these sites have been kind of examined independently, which I don't really think makes too much sense. And this approach might help us better conceptualize what was really going on socially and politically back at that time. Now, as we move on more to the western quadrant of town, we start to see different architecture. It is not as ancient. We're looking at between the 2nd and 3rd century BCE as the earliest points of construction. And we also start to see a lot of influence of the Puk region, right? Which makes sense since this region was very powerful and had its kind of tentacles expanding in all directions during this time. One of the sites that is most well known, dating of this period, is Chenho, which literally translates to little well, because, well, there's a little well site. It's very unlikely this is what it would have been called during antiquity. As you can see from this drone footage, it also exists in a urban context, is within a park, and is really quite large. There's several discrete structures that have received a good amount of restoration, which are very interesting to look at. We have this beautiful pyramid-like structure, and a little bit of remains of stucco on it as well, which is, always nice and good to see. What are likely administrative and also residential complexes, and, a whole host of different kinds of structures and civic infrastructure. This would have been, I think, one of the, larger secondary outposts of ancient To back in the time. as it's, not too far away, and also is starting to kind of straddle and connect Torishkansiko proper with sites further down to the southeast, like Akanke and Mayapan and all that. Although the foundation of Mayapan, as we know it today, would have come quite a bit later, after the fall of Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and the formation of the so-called League of Mayapan. Nearby to Chenho, we also have another very interesting site called El Cerrito. Here we basically just have one structure on its own, surrounded by a small urban park, but it is aesthetically quite beautiful. It's a quite nice little site, and also is, pretty close temporally to Chenho. And it's, really just a very nice place to go visit, take some pictures, and it's very enjoyable. Also in close vicinity is Las Tumbas. Now, this site is really interesting. As its name probably implies, within this structure, they found, I believe it was around 7 or 9 burials of elite members of society. They had with them different offerings like jade and obsidian, seashells. Here, obsidian is perhaps the most important, because there's no obsidian in the Yucatan. All the obsidian comes from, the highlands of the Maya in Guatemala, right? So these were clearly people of fairly high station, and it's interesting to have found these burials. And again, this is just an urban park. People go with their children, or walking around, or chilling out, and a lot of times they're not really mindful of what it is they are seeing and experiencing. Although this is one of the few sites that does actually have some signs, some signaling, and information about the discoveries that were made there, which is actually atypical for archaeological sites in Merida, as most of them are just presented without any context at all, which really is quite a problem, especially for people that are just, going around their business and, sometimes have no idea what it is they're actually looking at. Now, a little bit further south, we get to Sojila. Just to give you an idea, if you know Merida at all, Sojila is right behind the Kukulkan Alamo Stadium, right? Which is where our Major League Baseball team plays, Los Leones de Yucatan. Sojila is interesting for several reasons. For one, it is mentioned by name in the Chilam Balam. As the Itzais were, going through the region, they stopped here and made reference of, what a spectacular place it was and the experiences that they had there. The Itza are, of course, the people that would later go on to found great cities in the Mayan world in the north of Yucatan, like Itzna, and of course, the world-famous Chichen Itza. So this is notable in and of itself. But also, it is quite large. The remains we find here are of real considerable height, scope, size. Unfortunately, because it's so close to the airport, drone photography isn't really possible. But as you can see from here, these artificial platforms are quite large and have other structures, built atop them, as is fairly typical for this kind of architecture. Again, at the site we find Cehpech, Mayan roads that would have connected Sojila to other parts of the Pali. So it's a really interesting site. I can't really do justice to it through the photos, so I really recommend that you visit. Oftentimes when you're looking for it on Google Maps, it'll be listed as Granjas, Sojila archaeological site, and a lot of different points. But these are all like in a very kind of compressed area of geography. So really make sure to explore thoroughly, because there's a lot to see there. Although some parts of it are just kind of in the bush and are really hard to get to. So if you really want to see them, I recommend wearing long sleeve shirts and like at least jeans, because there's a lot of vegetation that can really irritate your skin. And I even one time saw a snake in there, so that's not terribly pleasant. We also see some ritual elements at the site, which are very interesting. And depending on the time of year you go, the vegetation could be, really overgrown, or, pretty decent, pretty easy to see. As with most municipal archaeological sites, the upkeep is really inconsistent, which is really always an ongoing issue. Now, one of the most recently excavated sites within Merida's city limits, or actually technically not really within Merida's city limits, but just barely, is Xiol in Canasin. It sits inside of an industrial park owned by a Chinese corporation, but they've really done a really great job and have been working with INA and have really gone above and beyond providing funds for the restoration of this site. What we see here is the core of the site. As you can see, there's a quadrant. We have some pseudo-pyramidal structures towards the northern part of the site, and everything is enclosed by main kind of like plaza-like acropolis. It runs along the highway, and on both sides of it, we can find structures with very obvious Puk architecture, which makes sense given the time within which this site was likely built, which was probably around the 8th century AD. Moving on further south towards Xoclán, which is where the fairgrounds are and where Merida holds its carnival celebrations, we find the city of Scotsman, or the archaeological site of Scotsman, if you can call it that, right? There has really been virtually no archaeological intervention that I am aware of going on there. I have found no good sources about it, and it is fairly mysterious for those reasons. We find what is probably the largest pyramid in Merida here at Scotsman, and as you can see, it is considerable in size, but also, like we talked about in Kaukil, has suffered from pillaging by locals, construction companies, and just about everybody, right? A lot of the people I talked to there in the community were saying that when they were children, this pyramid was 2 or 3 times larger, and not just because they were smaller, but because it actually was, and that's really interesting. Of course, we want to preserve the cultural heritage, but there is something kind of poetic about Maya peoples reclaiming these carved stones created by their ancestors to build something of their own. Though, I really wish they didn't. But anyway, that's a topic for another conversation. Here is Scotsman. Once you go actually up the pyramid, you can see some fairly well-preserved walls that have, collapsed on each other and are probably well-preserved for that reason. We don't know if this had been part of a corbel arch system and interior or what, though it does kind of look like that a bit to me. Let me know what you think in the comments. But it's really interesting and gives us a bit of a glimpse of the structure beyond just a mound of rocks. There are several other architectural features to be found in the site, but they are even more damaged, perhaps because they're smaller and easier to pillage. Although, again, who knows? They could have been considerably larger in size, and we just don't know. The whole area around has been paved over and built upon, so it's quite likely that there would have been quite a lot more there, but unfortunately, we will likely never know. Though, I'm pretty sure that if you were to get permission and go exploring in these people's backyards, you'd be finding considerable amount of ceramics and at least the foundations of ancient structures. So this is a really interesting place to look at. Any aspiring archaeologists might want to consider this as a place for field studies, as it, I think there's quite a bit there on offer. And we really know virtually nothing about it. I couldn't even find a firm date for habitation. Now, moving on to the north of the city, we have Hol, which is in Fraccionamiento de las Américas, which is where I live, within the comisaria of Sitia. And it is, a fairly sizable complex. Again, likely a residential complex, but also shows some signs that it was likely used for some ceremonial purposes or perhaps even burials. To be completely honest, the people who were working on this didn't do a tremendously good job. You can see cement just kind of poured in. This happens sometimes when developments or fraccionamientos are kind of in a hurry to get things in order so that they can continue along with construction. And sometimes the INA allows them to kind of subcontract out that responsibility, and they don't always do a really good job. We have seen this historically in several different sites across Mesoamerica, infamously in El Tazumal in El Salvador and other places like that. And it's not a great practice. You really want to take your time to make sure that you're getting things right. But regardless, it's really interesting. It sits, right in front of an OXXO. You have people selling tacos and hot dogs in the evenings right there on the corner. So it's just a fully integrated part of our kind of urban landscape, and a place that people see every day but probably don't think about too much. So again, something we are working to change. Towards Cholul, just beyond the Periférico, we also find a fair amount of archaeological remains. This structure here is really interesting given its context. It's right next to the offices of a construction company that built a lot of the homes in the area, and it has some beautiful stucco remains, and is surrounded by strip malls and a Domino's Pizza and all kinds of businesses and homes and stuff like that. So yeah, a really perfect example of urban archaeology within Merida's context. Go just a little bit further and you'll come across again, surprise, surprise, a roundabout, a glorieta with archaeological remains. Once again, an example of this practice, which, if not absolutely perfect, is definitely better than nothing. And we should always remember to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good here, right? So it's really interesting, really worth checking out. Now, towards the northeast of the city, in the area called as Altabrisa, which is one of the kind of more affluent parts of town, we see a lot of large apartment buildings, luxury stores, restaurants, the like. But there's also archaeology here, right? Right in the shadows of the towers, of the country towers, as they call them. Very little has been done here. It is possible to go in and explore on your own. Here, I really, again, recommend, wearing at least jeans, using a lot of bug repellent, and making sure that you have the physical fitness and wherewithal to not be tripping across stones and vegetation, because it is kind of hazardous. It is really interesting, but also quite concerning, because since this area is of such value in real estate terms, it's really hard to know what they are planning for this site, for this remains. I've made several inquiries to the INA asking about this, and as per usual, have gotten absolutely no response. So it's something to keep an eye on. We can find some structures here of really considerable size. It's a very interesting site, and again, just concerning because we don't have any idea what it is they're planning. There is a park which is going to be built rather nearby, but towards the other side of the towers. So there is a possibility that this will become an urban park as well, fingers crossed. But who the heck knows, right? Transparency is not exactly the INA's thing, and there's just no way of knowing without inquiring directly with them, which I have. I've also talked to some friends that are archaeologists and work at the INA, and they don't really seem to have a clear idea either. So I guess we'll see. But what we can see is that there's several trees in the area that have like those little yellow and red markers tied on them, which indicate that they're likely scheduled to be cut down. So there probably is something that's going to be happening there in the not too distant future. So let's keep an eye on it. Talking about sites that are endangered, if we take the highway to Progreso, we come across what we're calling now Tamanche. Tamanche used to be like a club, like a sport club back when I was growing up. And I had no idea that there was archaeological remains out there, but there definitely are. They're likely part of what would have at one point been Comchen, but as we can see from this drone imagery, it is now being prepared for suburbs, right? So whenever this happens, it's very concerning because we just don't know the plans of the developers. Maybe they'll build some parks and some protected areas, but maybe they won't. We talked about the practice of just, bulldozing and destroying archaeological remains. And sadly, this is something that happens. Though, if you ask the INA, they'll of course say, no, this never happens because categorically that's impossible. They don't destroy, they deconstruct. Now, this is a little bit better than simply coming in with a you bulldozer and getting rid of everything, because at least there's some surveying done and a bit of work, right? But in the end, it still means that the site will be essentially destroyed and will no longer be there for future generations to see and enjoy and gather, scientific information from. So again, a very concerning area. I've been going up there relatively often and taking drone images and seeing how it evolves over time. You can't really see very well from the images what is actually there because it's all covered in canopy. But there's also a really beautiful watering hole around there. An above ground cenote, of course, right? And it attracts a lot of birds and is a very pleasant place to go explore. And if you want to do it, I'd say do it sooner rather than later, as it's not likely to be there for very much longer. Yeah. So anyway, I hope you found this survey of archaeological Merida interesting. To be more specific, of course, of pre-Hispanic times into time of the Maya. If there's any sites that you think I should be exploring or checking out, or you would like me to do a little bit of research or check out, please let me know in the comments. I am attaching in the description of this video a Google map with the names and locations of the sites that we talked about today, as well as others which we did not cover, such as Villa Magna and a handful of other places. So anyway, thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. We're a growing channel and every follow counts, believe us. So thank you for your time. I'm Carlos Rosado Vandergrat of Yucatán Magazine, and we will see you next time.